It's July the 26th, 2026, and something strange just happened that almost nobody is reading correctly. For 2 nights in a row, the skies over Iran have gone quiet. No new strikes. No fresh footage of fireballs lighting up the horizon. After weeks of nightly bombing runs, the guns have gone silent, and the easy read on that would be relief. Maybe even the beginning of the end. But that is not what this pause actually is. This pause is the moment right before the biggest decision of the entire conflict gets made. And depending on which way it breaks, Iran, the region, and honestly, the entire global economy may never look the same again. So let's actually break down what's happening right now, because the quiet isn't peace. The quiet is the calm sitting directly on top of the most dangerous fork in the road this war has produced yet. Here's where things stand today. A Defense Department source confirmed that operations are officially on hold, and that's not a small detail because behind closed doors at a White House meeting just 2 days ago, Vice President J.D. Vance and General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, reportedly raised serious concerns, not about whether the campaign is working, but about how far it can keep going. 2 specific worries were on the table. Escalation risk, meaning the fear that continuing to hit Iran night after night eventually forces a response that nobody can control anymore. And munition stocks, meaning the blunt reality that the United States does not have an unlimited supply of precision weapons, especially the specialized bunker-busting hardware this campaign depends on. Think about that combination for a second. You've got the 2 most senior military and political voices in the room essentially saying, we might be running low on both patience and ammunition at the exact same time. That's not a comfortable position for any war planner to be sitting in. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic side, Mike Waltz, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, went on television this weekend and said the administration is giving talks some room to breathe. His exact framing was that negotiations are happening at every level, from technical staff all the way up to the highest levels of government. But in that same breath, he reminded everyone that the military remains, in his words, locked and loaded, and that the president is keeping every option on the table. That's the tightrope the entire administration is walking right now. Open the door to diplomacy just wide enough to see if Iran actually walks through it, while keeping the boot ready to kick it back down if they don't. And on the Iranian side, deputy foreign ministers from Iran and Oman have reportedly been meeting in Tehran specifically to talk about the Strait of Hormuz, which tells you exactly where the real pressure point of this entire war sits. It was never really about ideology. It's about that stretch of water. Now, before we go further into what the actual unthinkable move being discussed behind the scenes might look like, if you're finding this breakdown useful, take a second to like this video and drop a comment with where you think this is headed, because the split on this one is genuinely fascinating, and we're going to get into exactly why in a moment. And it's worth pausing on just how unusual it is for a vice president and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to be reported as pushing back on a sitting president's appetite for continued strikes in the same room. That's not the kind of internal disagreement that leaks out easily, and the fact that it did suggests the debate inside the administration is a lot more serious than the public messaging is letting on. On one side, you've got the instinct to finish what's been started, to use the momentum of 11 straight nights of strikes to permanently settle the nuclear question once and for all. On the other side, you've got the far more cautious, far more institutional voice reminding everyone that wars are easy to start and brutally difficult to end cleanly, and that the further this campaign stretches, the more exposed America's broader global posture becomes. That tension between finishing the job and knowing when to stop is exactly the tension defining this entire pause. Let's rewind a bit, because you can't understand how close we are to something unthinkable without understanding how we got here in the first place. Back in the summer of 2025, the United States carried out something called Operation Midnight Hammer, a mission 15 years in the making, dating back to when American intelligence first discovered Iran quietly building a fortified underground enrichment facility. That operation marked the first ever combat use of the GBU-57, the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, a 30,000-pound bunker-busting bomb specifically engineered to punch through more than 200 feet of rock and reinforced concrete before detonating. 14 of those weapons were dropped that night on Iran's most fortified nuclear sites, delivered by stealth bombers because they're the only aircraft in the American arsenal actually capable of carrying something that heavy. It was, by any measure, one of the most significant military strikes of the decade, and for a while it looked like it had done exactly what it was supposed to do. To understand why that single operation still matters so much a year later, you have to understand the scale of what it represented at the time. This wasn't a limited strike using a handful of standoff missiles fired from a safe distance. This was stealth bombers flying deep into contested airspace to deliver, by hand, some of the heaviest and most specialized ordnance in the entire American arsenal, against multiple hardened sites in a single coordinated night. Defense officials at the time described it as a plan that took months of positioning and preparation, built around misdirection and an extraordinary level of operational security, precisely because a mission like that only works if the element of surprise survives all the way to the moment of impact. 3 of Iran's most protected nuclear facilities were hit that night, and by nearly every account, the damage was severe. For a brief window, it genuinely looked like the underground question had been answered. But here's the twist nobody expected. There was one site left standing, a mountain on the southern edge of Iran's Natanz enrichment complex, known as Ku-e-Kolangazla, which translates roughly to Pickaxe Mountain. While the world's attention moved on, Iran kept digging into that mountain. Not stopped, not paused, kept going. And that is the site sitting at the absolute center of everything happening right now. The United Nations nuclear watchdog has never been given access to it. Nobody outside of Iran's own inner circle actually knows for certain what's been placed inside it, or how deep the actual working chambers go. President Trump has been increasingly blunt about it in recent days, telling reporters that the US would be hitting that area, in his words, pretty soon, and that there's not a thing Iran can do about it. He's also acknowledged something that should genuinely concern anyone paying attention, which is that Iran may have physically relocated centrifuges into Pickaxe Mountain, potentially at a depth that could challenge even the most powerful conventional weapons America has ever built. So let's actually sit with the physics of that for a second, because this is the technical heart of why this specific target has become the most talked about piece of unfinished business in the entire war. The GBU-57 is designed to penetrate roughly 200 feet of earth and rock before detonating. That's an enormous amount of material to punch through, and it's already the most capable weapon of its kind that exists. But military planners have reportedly discussed the idea of dropping 2 of these bombs in succession on the exact same spot, essentially using the first one to soften and crater the ground, so the second one can drive even deeper. Even with that kind of layered approach, there is genuine uncertainty inside defense circles about whether it would be enough to fully destroy a facility built specifically to sit below where Midnight Hammer's weapons could already reach. In other words, Iran didn't just rebuild after the first strike. They appear to have engineered their next facility as a direct answer to the exact weapon that hit them the first time. That's not a country that's given up. That's a country playing a very specific, very patient game of depth versus penetration, and right now, nobody outside of a classified briefing room actually knows who's winning that particular contest. And this is exactly why the word unthinkable keeps coming up in serious conversations about what happens next, because striking Pickaxe Mountain isn't just another night of bombing runs on missile depots and drone hangars. This would be a strike specifically aimed at what's left of Iran's nuclear program, using nearly the entire specialized stockpile of America's most powerful non-nuclear weapon, against a target where success genuinely cannot be guaranteed in advance. If it works, it could functionally end Iran's nuclear ambitions for a generation. If it doesn't fully succeed, or if intelligence about what's actually stored inside turns out to be wrong, you've used one of the most dramatic weapons in the American arsenal and potentially achieved far less than advertised, all while handing Iran the political narrative that they weathered America's absolute best shot and survived. That asymmetry, enormous risk against uncertain reward, is exactly the kind of decision that keeps people like Vance and Kane raising their hands in a White House meeting and asking whether this is really the moment to pull that trigger. Let's talk about the munitions piece for a second, because that's the part almost nobody outside defense circles is actually discussing, and it might be the single most important detail in this entire story. The GBU-57 isn't something you can just manufacture on demand in bulk. It's a specialized, expensive, low-volume weapon, and the number of stealth bombers capable of delivering it is limited by design, because that capability is meant to be held in reserve for the most extreme scenarios imaginable, not spent casually over the course of a prolonged regional conflict. Every one of those weapons used against Iran is one fewer available anywhere else on the planet if another crisis erupts somewhere else at the same time. That's the quiet math sitting behind Kane's reported concerns. It's not just about whether hitting Pickaxe Mountain is the right move against Iran specifically. It's about what happens to America's broader global readiness if the answer to every hardened target from here forward becomes reach for the same limited stockpile of bunker busters. War planners have to think several moves ahead, and right now the board has more than one active fire on it. Which brings us to the second front that's exploded into relevance just in the last few days, and it's one that almost perfectly illustrates how fast this conflict can spread sideways when nobody's looking. The Houthis in Yemen have opened up what's now being described as the most dangerous theater of the entire war, launching missiles and drones at Saudi oil infrastructure. They set the Jizan refinery ablaze, and they struck at Yanbu, which is the terminal handling roughly 92% of Saudi Arabia's seaborne crude oil exports. Read that number again, 92%. That's not a symbolic target. That is about as close as you can get to hitting the actual financial nervous system of one of the largest oil exporters on Earth. A Saudi-led coalition has already responded by striking Houthi positions in Yemen's Hodeidah region, and Yemen's own air force has hit back at Houthi missile and drone launch sites as well. So now you've got a completely separate shooting war layered directly on top of the US-Iran standoff, using Iran's own regional proxy network to keep pressure on the exact same economic pressure point, the flow of oil, without Tehran having to fire a single additional shot of its own. And this is a strategy Iran has leaned on for years, letting aligned militias and proxy forces do the provoking, while Tehran itself maintains a thin layer of deniability. It's the same playbook that's kept the Houthis relevant on the world stage for a decade, tying down naval assets, spiking insurance costs for commercial shipping, and now, with this latest strike on Yanbu, directly threatening the revenue base of a country that isn't even a formal party to the war. Saudi Arabia has largely stayed out of direct confrontation with Iran throughout this conflict, focused instead on its own economic diversification plans. But a strike on the terminal handling the overwhelming majority of its crude exports is not the kind of thing any government can simply absorb quietly. That's exactly why you're now seeing Saudi-led coalition aircraft actively hitting back at Houthi positions in Hodeidah, something that risks pulling yet another major regional power more directly into a conflict that started as a narrow standoff over enrichment sites and a shipping lane. Think about how much the map has expanded in just the last few weeks. What began as a dispute over centrifuges and inspection access has now touched the waters of the Persian Gulf, the mountains of central Iran, the coastline of Yemen, the refineries of western Saudi Arabia, and, as we'll get to in a moment, a sea thousands of miles to the north that most casual observers of this conflict never expected to hear mentioned at all. And if that wasn't enough of a second front, there's now a third one that's opened up in, of all places, the Caspian Sea. Iran is accusing Ukraine of carrying out a long-range strike that killed a sailor aboard an Iranian commercial vessel, calling it an act of aggression. Think about how strange that sentence is on its own. A war that started as a standoff over the Strait of Hormuz has now somehow pulled in a strike thousands of miles away in a body of water most people couldn't find on a map, involving a country that isn't even a direct party to the original conflict. That's what happens when a war like this runs long enough. The original battlefield stops being the only battlefield. Every actor with an old grudge or a strategic opening starts looking for their moment, and suddenly you've got fires burning in places that had nothing to do with the original spark. All of this is landing directly on ordinary people's wallets, by the way. And this is the part that turns an overseas military story into something everyone actually feels, regardless of where they live. Gas prices in the United States have surged nearly 95 cents higher per gallon than they were just a year ago, and analysts are pointing directly at Middle East instability driven by rising oil prices as the primary cause. That's not an abstract geopolitical footnote. That's the number on the sign at your local gas station, and it's a number that's going to keep climbing if the Strait of Hormuz remains contested and Saudi export terminals keep getting hit by drones. This is exactly why economic pressure has become just as important a battlefield in this war as anything happening in the skies over Tehran. Choking the flow of oil doesn't require winning a single dogfight. It just requires enough chaos near enough choke points to spook markets, and that's precisely what's been happening for weeks now. And it's not just American drivers feeling this. Every country that depends on Gulf crude, from major economies across Europe and Asia to smaller import-dependent nations that don't have the luxury of domestic production, is watching the Strait of Hormuz situation with genuine dread because roughly a fifth of the world's oil moves through that one narrow passage. Insurance premiums for tankers willing to even attempt the transit have reportedly climbed sharply, and some shipping companies have simply started rerouting around the region entirely, adding weeks to voyages and cost to everything that eventually shows up on a store shelf somewhere. This is the part of modern warfare that doesn't show up in dramatic footage of explosions, but ends up touching more lives than almost anything else in the conflict. The slow, grinding cost of uncertainty rippling through global supply chains. Other major powers with a stake in regional stability, from European governments worried about energy costs to Asian economies dependent on steady crude imports, have been quietly pushing for exactly the kind of diplomatic off-ramp Waltz has been describing. Not out of any particular loyalty to either side, but because a prolonged shutdown of that shipping lane would be an economic shock nobody wants to absorb on top of everything else already straining the global economy this year. Before we get into the actual strategic picture of where this goes from here, if you're new to this story and trying to piece together how we got from a nuclear standoff to Houthi strikes on Saudi refineries and a mystery attack in the Caspian Sea, that should tell you something on its own. This conflict has stopped behaving like a contained regional dispute and started behaving like a pressure system that finds the nearest weak point and pushes through it. Make sure you're subscribed if you want to keep tracking exactly how this keeps evolving, because the pace of new fronts opening up has honestly been faster than almost anyone predicted even a month ago. So, let's get into the actual diplomatic side of things, Because this is where the real tension of the current pause lies. On paper, there's genuine momentum toward talks. Waltz described diplomatic efforts as having ramped up, particularly over the past few days, at every level of government. Iran's foreign ministry has confirmed that mediator proposals are currently under review, and the fact that deputy foreign ministers from Iran and Oman spent 2 straight days in Tehran specifically discussing the Strait of Hormuz tells you exactly what any eventual deal is going to have to center on. Whoever controls the terms of transit through that strait effectively controls the single most important economic lever in this entire war. Even Pakistan's foreign minister held a call with the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency this weekend, specifically about the broader conflict, underscoring what both sides described as the importance of continued diplomacy and dialogue. When you've got a third country's foreign minister and the world's top nuclear watchdog specifically getting on the phone to talk about this, that tells you the international community understands just how close this situation is sitting to something that can't be walked back. But here's the honesty check nobody wants to sit with, and it's the exact same honesty check that's been true of every ceasefire attempt in this entire conflict going back to its earliest days. A pause is not the same thing as an ending. This is now the second time in just a few months that operations have gone quiet, only to reignite. And every previous quiet period has eventually broken because one side or the other decided the pause was being used by the other to simply regroup rather than genuinely negotiate. So when you hear that talks are ongoing at every level, the fair question to ask is, ongoing toward what exactly? A framework where Iran agrees to permanently step back from anything resembling weapons-grade enrichment and gives international inspectors real access to sites like Pickaxe Mountain? Or another temporary arrangement that buys both sides a few weeks of breathing room before the exact same flashpoints reignite the exact same fighting? That question matters enormously because it's really the fork in the road behind everything we've been talking about. If the diplomatic track actually produces something real, something with verified inspections and a genuine rollback of the underground program, then the unthinkable strike on Pickaxe Mountain potentially never has to happen at all. And Iran gets to walk away from this having lost enormous military and economic capacity, but at least kept its core sovereignty intact. But if these talks turn out to be exactly what skeptics fear, a stalling tactic used to buy time while digging continues underground, then the pressure to finally finish the job at Pickaxe Mountain, munitions concerns and all, becomes almost impossible for any administration to resist, because at that point, the alternative is watching a program you've spent an entire war trying to shut down simply reconstitute itself the moment your attention shifts elsewhere. And this is really the crux of why the phrase, Iran will never be the same, applies no matter which direction this breaks. If the strike on Pickaxe Mountain actually happens and actually succeeds, you're looking at the effective end of Iran's nuclear ambitions for the foreseeable future, a program built over decades, survived through sanctions, survived through assassinations of its own scientists, survived an entire previous round of American and Israeli strikes, finally reaching a point where its most protected asset gets buried for good. That's a civilization-altering outcome for a country that has staked enormous political and religious legitimacy on its nuclear program as a symbol of sovereignty and resistance. But if the diplomatic path wins out instead, and Iran actually agrees to real, verifiable rollback in exchange for economic relief and an end to the blockade, that's arguably just as transformative, because it would represent the first time in decades that Tehran's leadership chose survival and economic stability over the nuclear card it's held onto through every previous crisis. Either path represents an ending to the status quo that's defined Iran's relationship with the rest of the world since the program first became public. There's no version of this where things simply go back to how they were before this war started. Let's actually walk through the realistic paths this can take from here, because there really are only a handful of ways this plays out, and it helps to lay them side by side, rather than treating this as one vague, undefined future. The first path is the one everyone's hoping for, a genuine diplomatic breakthrough. In this version, the current pause holds. The technical level talks that Waltz described turn into something with real teeth, and Iran agrees to allow inspectors into Pickaxe Mountain in exchange for sanctions relief and an end to the naval blockade. This is the version where the war ends, not with a final bomb, but with a signature on a document, and where Iran's leadership, having watched its coastal defenses, its command infrastructure, and its economy get hammered for months, decides that survival matters more than finishing an underground facility. Nobody can even use without inviting another strike anyway. It's the least dramatic outcome, but arguably the most stable one, because it's the only path that doesn't require anyone to bet on the accuracy of intelligence about a facility nobody has actually been allowed to inspect. The second path is the one this entire video has been built around, the actual unthinkable strike. In this version, the talks stall, or worse, intelligence suggests Iran is using the pause to finish work inside the mountain rather than negotiate in good faith. And the decision finally comes down to send the bombers back in, spending a significant portion of the remaining GBU-57 stockpile on a single, all-or-nothing attempt to bury what's left of the program for good. This is the highest risk, highest reward option on the table. If it works, it's remembered as the strike that finally ended Iran's nuclear ambitions after 2 decades of diplomacy failed to do it. If it doesn't fully succeed, it risks becoming the strike that proved even America's most powerful conventional weapon has limits, and that's a message every other country quietly building underground that would rather not exist. And then there's a third path that doesn't get talked about nearly as much, but is arguably just as plausible, given how this war has behaved so far, which is simply more of the same. More pauses, more resumptions, more proxy strikes from the Houthis, more skirmishes in unexpected places like the Caspian, without either a clean diplomatic resolution or a decisive final strike. This is the grinding, exhausting middle path, the one where the war doesn't end so much as it becomes a permanent, low-simmering feature of the region, flaring up every few weeks whenever talks stall or a tanker gets hit, without either side ever fully committing to the extremes on either end. If you've been tracking this conflict for any length of time, you know this third path is honestly the one with the strongest track record so far, because that's basically been the pattern for months now. Escalation, pause, near resolution, escalation again. Let's also talk about what's happening inside Iran itself during all of this, because a country doesn't absorb this level of sustained military and economic pressure without internal consequences. This war has already seen Iran's naval blockade reinstated for a second time in just a few months. Its entire southern coastal defense grid systematically dismantled over a sustained multi-night strike campaign, and its command and control infrastructure repeatedly targeted. Layer onto that the fact that oil exports, the actual lifeblood of the regime's revenue, are now being squeezed from multiple directions at once, through this blockade at Hormuz, and through Houthi strikes disrupting the broader regional oil trade. A government that can't move its oil and can't guarantee safe passage through the waters it claims to control is a government whose economic foundation is genuinely cracking in real time. And history tells us that when the economic pressure on a regime like this becomes severe enough for long enough, the instability doesn't stay contained to the battlefield. It starts showing up in the streets, in internal power struggles, in exactly the kind of fracture within leadership circles that becomes impossible to paper over with rhetoric alone. There have already been reports throughout this conflict of tension between Iran's political leadership in Tehran and the more hardline military commanders who actually control operations along the coast and around the Strait. And a prolonged squeeze on oil revenue is exactly the kind of pressure that tends to widen those cracks rather than heal them. A regime that can't pay its own security forces reliably, can't guarantee fuel and food distribution stays stable, and can't even promise safe passage through the waters it claims to control, is a regime that starts spending as much energy managing its own internal stability as it does managing the war outside its borders. That's a genuinely dangerous position for any government to be in, because it raises the odds of miscalculation, of a local commander acting without full authorization from the top, of exactly the kind of unpredictable escalation that turns a tense pause into a sudden crisis nobody actually planned for. So here's the actual strategic picture as it stands today, July 26th. You've got a 2-night pause that's being read by some as the first real crack toward peace, and by others as simply the eye of the storm before the single most consequential strike of the entire war. You've got the 2 most senior military and political voices in the room reportedly urging caution, not because the campaign hasn't worked, but because continuing it carries real risk to America's broader global military posture, and a real chance of triggering a level of escalation nobody can fully predict or control. You've got a diplomatic track that's genuinely active, with conversations happening from technical staff all the way up to senior leadership, and a third-party mediator process specifically focused on the one asset that actually determines the economic stakes of this entire conflict, the Strait of Hormuz. And sitting underneath all of it, quite literally, is a mountain that nobody outside of Iran's inner circle has actually been allowed to inspect, holding what may be the last meaningful piece of Iran's nuclear program, waiting for a decision that could either end this chapter of history through diplomacy or end it through the single most technically demanding strike the American military has ever attempted. What happens in the next 72 hours genuinely could define how this entire conflict gets remembered for decades. Does the pause hold long enough for a real framework to emerge? One where inspectors finally get access to Pickaxe Mountain and the Strait of Hormuz reopens under some kind of internationally guaranteed arrangement? Or does this quiet period end the way so many previous ones have, with a decision that the time for patience has run out and the order finally comes down to send the bombers back over that mountain one more time? This time aiming to finish what Midnight Hammer started over a year ago? Either outcome reshapes the region, Either outcome reshapes how the rest of the world thinks about what it actually takes to permanently dismantle a nuclear program once a country has decided to build one, no matter the cost. What do you think happens next? Do you think the pause holds and this actually moves toward a real diplomatic resolution? Or do you think we're just watching the calm before the single biggest strike of this entire war finally gets the green light? Let me know exactly where you land in the comments below, because this is genuinely one of the closest calls this conflict has produced yet. And if you want to keep following exactly how this develops, hour by hour and front by front, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who's trying to make sense of everything happening right now, and subscribe so you don't miss whatever decision comes out of the next few days, because whichever way this breaks, it is going to be a decision that changes the region for a very long time to come.